The courtroom fell into stunned silence. All eyes were on the black teenager standing before the judge, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the scorn that had been directed at her just moments earlier. Judge Harrison, infamous for his sharp tongue and condescending attitude, had spent the last 20 minutes berating her, mocking her for daring to represent herself in such a serious case. "You think you can fool this court?" he had sneered, his laughter echoing through the room. "A child playing dress-up as an attorney? This is a courtroom, young lady, not a school play." But then she spoke. In a voice steady and clear, she began dismantling the prosecution's case. Her knowledge of legal precedent and her razor-sharp arguments left the judge and the seasoned lawyers in the room dumbfounded. Gasps rippled through the audience as it became apparent that this teenager was no ordinary defendant. The judge's smug expression faded, replaced by confusion and growing unease. "I object," one of the prosecutors interrupted, his face red with frustration. "Your Honor, I have reason to believe this individual is not who she claims to be." The teenager turned her piercing gaze toward the prosecutor and smiled faintly. "Your Honor, I can provide my credentials if necessary, but I assure you every word I've spoken is legally sound. Shall we continue?" Judge Harrison's face had turned a deep shade of crimson. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking under the weight of his disbelief. The girl reached into her satchel, pulled out a pristine document, and handed it to the bailiff. The paper was passed up to the judge. As he read it, his hands trembled, his mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The audience waited, breathless. Now let's go back to where it all began. The story started in the quiet suburbs of Chicago, where 17-year-old Emma Carter lived with her grandmother, Evelyn. Emma was no ordinary teenager. She had been a child prodigy, reading law books for fun by the age of 7 and debating college students by 12. Despite her brilliance, she chose to keep a low profile, uninterested in the attention that came with her intelligence. Her grandmother, a retired schoolteacher, often reminded her of the importance of humility and using her gifts for good. One day, while helping her grandmother with groceries, Emma overheard a conversation at the corner store. A local single mother, Sarah Johnson, was in tears, explaining to the cashier that her landlord was evicting her and her 2 young children. "I don't have anywhere to go," Sarah sobbed. "I've paid every cent on time, but he says I violated the lease. I didn't. I swear I didn't." Emma's heart sank. She approached Sarah after the conversation and asked what had happened. Sarah explained that her landlord claimed she had too many people living in the apartment. "It's just me and my babies," Sarah insisted. "He's lying because he wants to raise the rent for someone else." Emma's mind raced. She asked Sarah if she had kept copies of her payments in the lease agreement. Sarah nodded and said she had everything stored in a folder at home. Emma felt a spark of determination. "Let me help you," she said firmly. "I think you have a case." Sarah looked at her in disbelief. "But you're just a kid." Emma smiled. "I've been told that before. Trust me." Over the next few days, Emma pored over Sarah's documents. The landlord's claims were riddled with inconsistencies. She decided to write a formal letter to the landlord, demanding that he cease the eviction and threatening legal action if he didn't comply. When the landlord ignored her, she helped Sarah file a case in small claims court. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. The teenager who always had her nose in books was standing up for justice. The case caught the attention of local reporters, and Emma's involvement became the headline of every small-town news outlet. But not everyone was impressed. Some questioned her qualifications, while others mocked the idea of a teenager taking on such a serious matter. As the court date approached, Sarah grew increasingly anxious. "What if we lose? I don't have money for a lawyer," she said. Emma reassured her. But deep down, she knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just about Sarah. It was about standing up to injustice, and proving that age and skin color didn't determine capability. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Spectators, reporters, and even some lawyers had come to watch the child attorney in action. Emma, dressed in a plain navy blazer and skirt, carried herself with a quiet confidence that belied her years. But as soon as she stepped forward to speak, Judge Harrison interrupted her. "And who are you supposed to be?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm representing the plaintiff, Your Honor," Emma replied calmly. The judge chuckled, shaking his head. "You must be joking. Is this a prank?" The room filled with whispers and stifled laughter. Emma stood firm, her expression unchanging. Judge Harrison continued to ridicule her, questioning her credibility and making remarks about how kids these days didn't understand the seriousness of the law. Emma endured it all silently, waiting for her moment to speak. When the opportunity finally came, she presented her case with precision and clarity, citing legal precedent and exposing the landlord's lies. The room grew quiet as she spoke, her words commanding attention and respect. But the moment that left everyone speechless was when she revealed her true identity. Emma Carter, a certified legal prodigy who had passed the bar exam at just 16, something she had kept secret until now. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Judge Harrison's gavel slammed against the bench. Just as Emma stood tall, poised to deliver the final blow to the prosecution's flimsy arguments, the judge leaned forward, his face pale. "This court is adjourned for a 10-minute recess," he stammered, clearly needing time to process what had just unfolded. Emma's eyes followed him as he retreated to his chambers, and a small smile crept across her face. This was only the beginning. The courtroom buzzed with chatter as the recess began. Spectators leaned toward one another, whispering about the teenage attorney who had just stunned the judge and prosecution alike. Some marveled at her poise. Others were skeptical, insisting this had to be some kind of elaborate hoax. Emma remained seated at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly together. Despite her composed exterior, her heart raced. She had revealed her credentials, a bold move, but it had come with risks. Now there was no turning back. Sarah leaned towards her, her voice barely audible over the noise. "Emma, are you sure we're going to win this? They're acting like you're some kind of fraud." Emma turned to her, her voice steady. "They're acting that way because they're afraid. The truth is on our side, Sarah, trust me." Before Sarah could respond, the bailiff announced the judge's return. The room fell silent as Judge Harrison re-entered, his face an unreadable mask. He took his seat and cleared his throat. "This court will now resume," he said, his voice firmer than before. His gaze shifted toward Emma, but the arrogance from earlier had vanished. "Miss Carter, the court acknowledges your credentials. You may proceed, but I advise you to tread carefully. You are still representing your client in a very serious matter." Emma stood and walked to the front of the courtroom, her every movement deliberate. She could feel the weight of the stairs on her back, but she blocked it out, focusing only on the task at hand. "Your Honor," she began, "I would like to submit additional evidence that further undermines the defense's claims." She approached the bench and handed the judge a stack of documents, copies of emails between Sarah and the landlord, all of which contradicted his claims about lease violations. Emma had highlighted key phrases in bright yellow, ensuring nothing could be missed. Judge Harrison studied the documents in silence, his expression growing more serious with each passing second. When he finally looked up, he turned to the landlord's attorney, Mr. Bennett. "Mr. Bennett," the judge said, his voice sharp, "these emails directly contradict your client's testimony. Do you have an explanation for this?" The landlord's attorney, a middle-aged man with graying hair, hesitated. "Your Honor, these emails could have been fabricated. We would need time to verify their authenticity." Emma didn't flinch. "Your Honor, I anticipated that argument," she said, pulling out another sheet of paper. "Here is the chain of custody for these emails, including metadata verification from a certified digital forensics expert." The courtroom erupted into murmurs again. Judge Harrison's gavel came down with a bang. "Order," he shouted, "order!" Emma returned to her seat, her confidence unshaken. The judge turned back to the landlord's attorney. "Mr. Bennett, unless you can provide concrete evidence to refute this, I will have no choice but to consider these emails valid." The defense attorney stumbled over his words, clearly caught off guard. "Your Honor, we need additional time to review." "Denied," the judge interrupted, his tone icy. "We've already spent too much time on this matter. Miss Carter, continue." Emma rose again, her voice unwavering as she outlined the timeline of events, linking the landlord's actions to clear violations of housing laws. She brought up precedent after precedent, each one reinforcing Sarah's case. At one point, the landlord himself, a burly man with a sour expression, leaned over to whisper furiously to his attorney. Emma noticed but didn't let it distract her. Instead, she pressed on, her arguments growing more persuasive with each passing minute. But then something unexpected happened. As Emma began summarizing her final points, the landlord abruptly stood up, his face red with anger. She's lying, he shouted, pointing at Emma. This whole thing is a setup. There's no way a kid like her knows all this legal stuff. The courtroom erupted into chaos once again. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel repeatedly, his voice booming over the noise. Order in the court. Sit down, Mr. Thompson, or I will hold you in contempt. The landlord reluctantly sat, his chest heaving with fury. Emma took a deep breath, maintaining her composure despite the outburst. Your Honor, she said calmly, if Mr. Thompson has any evidence to support his accusations, I invite him to present it. Otherwise, I request that the court focus on the facts. The judge nodded, his expression stern. Mr. Thompson, you will remain silent unless called upon to speak. Miss Carter, you may continue. Emma finished her presentation, her closing remarks delivered with the precision and authority of someone twice her age. When she finally sat down, a wave of relief washed over her, but she knew the battle wasn't over yet. The defense attorney called his next witness, a maintenance worker from the apartment complex, who claimed to have seen multiple people entering and leaving Sarah's unit. Emma listened carefully, jotting down notes as the man spoke. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she approached the witness stand with a calm, measured stride. Mr. Davis, she began, you testified that you saw multiple people entering and leaving Miss Johnson's apartment. Can you specify how many people and when this occurred? The man hesitated. Maybe 4 or 5 people, and it was a couple of months ago. Emma nodded. A couple of months ago. Do you remember the exact dates? No, not exactly, he admitted. Did you report this to anyone at the time? Well, no, the man said, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. It didn't seem like a big deal then. Emma's lips curved into a faint smile. So, to clarify, you're unable to provide specific dates or evidence to support your claim. Is that correct? The man frowned but nodded. Yeah, I guess so. Thank you, Mr. Davis, Emma said, stepping away from the stand. As she returned to her seat, she glanced at Sarah, who gave her a nervous but grateful smile. The rest of the day's proceedings were uneventful compared to the earlier drama, but tension hung thick in the air as the court adjourned for the day. Outside, reporters swarmed Emma and Sarah, shouting questions and snapping photos. Emma shielded Sarah as best she could, guiding her through the crowd. Back at home, Emma collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion finally catching up to her. Evelyn placed a cup of tea in front of her and sat down. You were incredible today, her grandmother said softly. I'm so proud of you. Emma managed a tired smile. Thanks, Grandma, but it's not over yet. Tomorrow is going to be even tougher. Evelyn reached out and squeezed her hand. You've got this, Emma. Just remember why you're doing it. Emma nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. For people like Sarah. For everyone who's been told they're not enough. The next morning, Emma arrived at the courthouse early, ready to face whatever came next. But as she walked through the doors, she was greeted by a sight she hadn't anticipated. 2 police officers standing near the entrance, speaking with the landlord. One of the officers spotted Emma and began walking toward her, a grim expression on his face. Miss Carter, he said, we need to talk. Emma froze for a moment, her mind racing. She scanned the officer's expression, searching for any hint of what this confrontation might be about. Sarah, who had been walking a few steps behind her, caught up and immediately sensed the tension. Is there a problem, officer? Emma asked, keeping her voice steady. The officer glanced at the landlord, who was smirking smugly from across the lobby. We've received a report from Mr. Thompson alleging that you falsified evidence in this case. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Emma's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. That's a serious accusation, she said. What evidence does he have to support it? The officer shifted uncomfortably. We're not here to determine that. We're just doing our due diligence. We need you to come down to the station to answer some questions. The smug look on the landlord's face grew wider. Emma met his gaze, her expression unflinching. I understand, she said to the officer, but I'd like to speak with my client in legal counsel before I go anywhere. The officer hesitated but nodded. Fine, don't take too long. Emma turned to Sarah and spoke in a low voice. This is a scare tactic. He's trying to rattle us because he knows his case is falling apart. But what if they arrest you? Sarah whispered, panic rising in her voice. What if they... They won't, Emma said firmly. I've done nothing wrong and they have no proof otherwise. Stay calm and don't say anything to the landlord or his attorney. Sarah nodded reluctantly. Emma then stepped aside and called her grandmother. Evelyn answered on the first ring. Emma, is everything okay? Grandma, I need you to contact Mr. Phillips, Emma said. referring to a family friend who was a retired attorney. The landlord just made a false accusation against me, and the police want to question me. Evelyn's voice hardened. Stay strong, sweetheart. I'll get in touch with him right away. Don't let them intimidate you. I won't, Emma promised before ending the call. She turned back to the officer who was waiting nearby. I'm ready, she said, but I want to make it clear that I've done nothing illegal. This is an attempt to intimidate me. The officer nodded but didn't respond. As they walked toward the station, Emma kept her head high, refusing to give the landlord the satisfaction of seeing her falter. At the police station, Emma was taken to a small interrogation room. It was bare except for a metal table and 2 chairs. One of the officers who had escorted her sat down across from her, placing a tape recorder on the table. Miss Carter, the officer began, you're not under arrest, but we need to ask you some questions about the evidence you submitted in court. Mr. Thompson claims that it was fabricated. Emma folded her hands on the table, her expression calm. The evidence I submitted is authentic. I have documentation to prove its validity, including a chain of custody report from a certified digital forensics expert. The officer frowned slightly. Do you have those documents with you? They're in my case file, which is back in the courtroom, Emma replied. You're welcome to review them. The officer hesitated, then leaned back in his chair. Why would Mr. Thompson make these accusations if they weren't true? Because he's desperate, Emma said bluntly. His case is falling apart, and he knows it. This is his way of trying to discredit me and delay the proceedings. The officer studied her for a moment, then stood up. Wait here. Emma exhaled slowly as the officer left the room. Despite her composed exterior, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of doubt. What if this derailed the case? What if they believed the landlord's lies? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. The officer returned, followed by Mr. Phillips, the family friend and retired attorney Evelyn had contacted. He was an older man with sharp eyes and a confident stride. He gave Emma a reassuring nod before addressing the officer. I'm here as Miss Carter's legal counsel, Mr. Phillips said. What exactly is the basis for this questioning? The officer explained the landlord's accusations, but as Mr. Phillips listened, his expression didn't waver. When the officer finished, Mr. Phillips leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. This is a baseless claim, he said. If Mr. Thompson has evidence to support these allegations, let him present it. Otherwise, you're detaining my client without cause. The officer shifted uncomfortably. We're not detaining her. Then she's free to go? Mr. Phillips interrupted. Unless you're planning to arrest her, this conversation is over. The officer hesitated but finally nodded. She's free to go, but we'll be following up on this. Emma stood, her confidence returning. I'll be happy to cooperate within the bounds of the law, she said. As they left the station, Mr. Phillips placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. You handled yourself well, he said, but be careful. This landlord is playing dirty. Emma nodded. I expected as much. Thank you for coming. Anytime, Mr. Phillips replied. Now go win that case. When Emma returned to the courthouse, Sarah ran to her, relief evident on her face. Are you okay? What happened? They let me go, Emma said. They didn't have anything to hold me on. Sarah sighed in relief, but the tension lingered in her eyes. What do we do now? We stick to the plan, Emma said firmly. This is just another obstacle. We'll get through it. The hearing resumed that afternoon, but the atmosphere in the courtroom was noticeably different. The landlord sat with a smug expression, clearly expecting the police encounter to have rattled Emma. But as she stood to continue her argument, it was as if nothing had happened. Emma methodically picked apart the landlord's remaining defenses, presenting evidence and calling witnesses who testified to his history of exploiting tenants. The tension in the room grew with each passing minute, and by the end of the day, the landlord's confidence had begun to crack. But just as Emma felt they were gaining ground, another twist threw everything into chaos. As the court prepared to adjourn, the landlord's attorney stood and addressed the judge. Your Honor, we've just received new evidence that we believe will change the course of this case. We request an emergency motion to introduce it tomorrow. The judge frowned. What kind of evidence? The attorney hesitated, clearly trying to make it sound more dramatic than it was. Financial records that suggest Miss Johnson has been withholding information about her income. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Emma's heart sank as she glanced at Sarah, who looked utterly confused. The judge banged his gavel for silence. We'll review the motion tomorrow, Judge Harrison said. Court is adjourned for the day. As Emma packed up her files, she couldn't shake the sinking feeling in her chest. If the landlord's team had fabricated evidence, it could derail everything. She turned to Sarah, who was pale and trembling. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered. "What financial records? I don't have anything to hide." Emma placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, we'll figure it out." But as they walked out of the courthouse, Emma couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that the battle was about to get even tougher. And this time, the stakes felt higher than ever. That night, Emma stayed up late in her room, combing through every document, email, and note related to the case. She knew the landlord's team was pulling every trick in the book, but she needed to anticipate their next move. The mention of financial records didn't make sense. Sarah had been transparent about her income, and Emma had reviewed her bank statements herself. Emma's laptop screen glowed faintly in the dim room as she typed out possible arguments and strategies. Her grandmother Evelyn poked her head in, her expression soft with concern. "You need rest, sweetheart," Evelyn said gently. "You can't fight this battle if you're running on fumes." "I know, Grandma," Emma replied, not looking up, "but I need to figure out what they're planning. I can't let them blindside us tomorrow." Evelyn walked in and placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. "You've done everything you can tonight. Trust yourself and trust that the truth will come out." Emma sighed, nodding reluctantly. "You're right," she said, shutting her laptop. "I'll get some sleep." But as she lay in bed, her mind refused to quiet. What kind of evidence could they possibly have? And how far were they willing to go to discredit Sarah? The next morning, the courtroom was packed again. Word had spread about the landlord's last-minute motion, and everyone was eager to see what would happen next. Emma and Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table, both trying to appear calm despite the tension in the air. Judge Harrison entered, his face as stern as ever. "This court is now in session," he announced. "Mr. Bennett, you may proceed with your motion." The landlord's attorney, Mr. Bennett, stood and approached the bench, carrying a thick folder. "Your Honor, these are financial records that suggest Miss Johnson has been receiving income from undisclosed sources. We believe this information is relevant to the case, as it pertains to her ability to pay rent and the claims of financial hardship she has made." He handed the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Judge Harrison flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. "Miss Carter," the judge said, looking up, "have you had an opportunity to review this evidence?" Emma stood. "No, Your Honor, this is the first time I'm seeing it. I would request time to review these documents and verify their authenticity." Mr. Bennett immediately objected. "Your Honor, the evidence is straightforward and should be admitted immediately. Any delay would unfairly disadvantage my client." Emma stepped forward. "Your Honor, this evidence was presented at the 11th hour with no prior notice. Given the seriousness of these allegations, it's only fair that we be allowed time to examine it thoroughly." The judge considered this for a moment before nodding. "Miss Carter is correct. The plaintiff will have until tomorrow morning to review this evidence. Court is adjourned for the day." As soon as the hearing ended, Emma and Sarah hurried out of the courtroom and found a quiet corner to go through the documents. Emma's heart sank as she flipped through the pages. The records included bank statements and payment logs that seemed to suggest Sarah had been receiving large sums of money from an unknown source. "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I've never seen these before. They're not mine." Emma studied the documents closely, her analytical mind racing. "These look official, but something feels off. I'm going to dig deeper." She pulled out her laptop and started cross-referencing the account numbers and transaction details. After an hour of painstaking research, she found the first clue. "Look at this," Emma said, pointing to the screen. "The account these payments are coming from belongs to a company called Horizon Ventures. Have you ever heard of them?" Sarah shook her head. "No, what do they do?" "I'm not sure yet," Emma said, typing furiously, "but I'm going to find out." Her search revealed that Horizon Ventures was a shell company with no real business operations. Its listed address was a P.O. box in a distant state, and its website was a single page with vague descriptions of consulting services. Emma's gut told her this company was a front, but she needed proof. "Sarah, this could be our smoking gun," Emma said. "If we can link Horizon Ventures to Mr. Thompson, we can prove that these records were fabricated." "But how do we do that?" Sarah asked, desperation creeping into her voice. Emma leaned back, her mind racing. "We'll need help. I'm going to call someone I trust." That evening, Emma met with Jake, a tech-savvy friend from her neighborhood who had helped her with research in the past. Jake was a college student majoring in cybersecurity, and he loved a good challenge. "Fabricated financial records?" Jake said, raising an eyebrow. That's shady, but if there's a digital trail, I'll find it. Emma handed him the documents and explained what she had discovered so far. Jake's fingers flew across his keyboard as he began digging into Horizon Ventures. After an hour of silence, and he leaned back with a triumphant grin. Got it. Horizon Ventures is registered under a holding company that's owned by, wait for it, your landlord, Mr. Thompson. Emma's jaw tightened. So he's behind this. He created fake records to frame Sarah. Looks like it, Jake said, and I've got the digital breadcrumbs to prove it. These transactions were fabricated using template software, an amateur move. Emma smiled for the first time all day. Jake, you're a lifesaver. Just doing my part, he said with a shrug. I'll send you everything you need, but be careful. Guys like this don't play fair. The next morning, Emma walked into the courtroom with a renewed sense of determination. She had spent the night organizing Jake's findings into a comprehensive presentation, and she was ready to dismantle the landlord's latest scheme. When the hearing resumed, Mr. Bennett confidently presented the financial records to the court, reiterating his claim that Sarah had been hiding income. Judge Harrison turned to Emma. Miss Carter, are you ready to respond? Emma stood, her voice steady. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to present evidence that these financial records are fraudulent and were fabricated by Mr. Thompson to discredit my client. Gasps filled the room as Emma walked to the front and began her presentation. She explained the connection between Horizon Ventures and Mr. Thompson, detailing how the company had been used to create fake transactions. She handed over copies of Jake's findings, which included screenshots, metadata, and a step-by-step explanation of the forgery process. By the time she finished, the landlord's smug expression had vanished. He whispered furiously to his attorney, who looked pale and flustered. Judge Harrison studied the evidence for several long moments before addressing the landlord directly. Mr. Thompson, do you have any explanation for this? The landlord stammered, his face turning red. I didn't do anything. This is a setup. The judge's expression hardened. The evidence says otherwise. I am deeply disturbed by these actions, which appear to be an attempt to manipulate this court. I will be referring this matter for further investigation. Emma returned to her seat, her heart pounding. She had won this round, but she knew the battle wasn't over. As the judge adjourned for the day, she glanced at Sarah, who looked at her with tears of gratitude in her eyes. But just as they began packing up their things, Mr. Bennett stood and made an announcement that sent a chill down Emma's spine. Your Honor, in light of these allegations, my client intends to countersue for defamation. We'll be filing the paperwork immediately. The announcement hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. A countersuit? Emma's mind raced. She knew this was another ploy by the landlord to intimidate and exhaust Sarah into submission, but it added a new layer of complexity to an already grueling fight. Judge Harrison raised a skeptical brow at Mr. Bennett. You intend to countersue for defamation after being implicated in the fabrication of evidence. This court will require compelling proof to even entertain such a claim. Mr. Bennett straightened his tie, his expression smug. Your Honor, we'll provide that proof. The accusations against my client are baseless, and we believe this case has unfairly damaged his reputation. The judge exhaled heavily, clearly displeased. You may file your motion, but be advised. This court will not tolerate frivolous litigation. Proceed at your own risk. The gavel came down, adjourning the session for the day. As the courtroom emptied, Emma remained seated, her thoughts churning. Sarah sat beside her, visibly shaken. Emma, Sarah whispered, what does this mean? Can he really do this? Emma turned to her, her eyes filled with determination. He's bluffing, Sarah. He knows his case is weak, so he's trying to scare us into backing down. But we're not going anywhere. That evening, Emma gathered her team, Sarah, her grandmother Evelyn, and Jake, for an emergency strategy session at her home. Evelyn had made tea for everyone, and the aroma filled the small living room as Emma laid out her plan. This countersuit is a distraction, Emma began, but we can't ignore it. If we let it gain traction, it could muddy the waters and make it harder for the judge to see the truth. Jake leaned forward. I've been digging into Thompson's financial records. The guy's got skeletons in his closet, Emma. I've found transactions tied to other shell companies, and it looks like he's been using them to dodge taxes and funnel money. Evelyn's eyes widened. That's serious. Could it help your case? It could, Emma said, but we need to tread carefully. If we bring it up, we'll need solid proof and a strategy to tie it back to the case. Sarah looked overwhelmed. This is so much. I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to protect my kids and keep our home. Emma placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I know, Sarah, and that's exactly what we're going to do. No matter how dirty they play, we're not backing down. The next day, Emma walked into the courtroom prepared for another battle. True to his word, Mr. Bennett had filed the countersuit, claiming that Sarah's accusations had caused Mr. Thompson severe emotional distress and irreparable harm to his reputation. Judge Harrison reviewed the motion with a skeptical eye. Mr. Bennett, your motion makes bold claims. Do you have evidence to support these allegations? Mr. Bennett nodded. Yes, Your Honor. We intend to call witnesses who can testify to the damage these baseless accusations have caused my client. Emma stood. Your Honor, we believe this countersuit is an attempt to distract from the real issue, Mr. Thompson's misconduct. We request the opportunity to depose Mr. Thompson and his witnesses before this motion proceeds further. The judge considered this for a moment. Very well. Depositions will be scheduled before we move forward. Court is adjourned. A week later, Emma sat in a small conference room facing Mr. Thompson and his attorney. The deposition was tense from the start. Mr. Bennett tried to deflect questions and steer the conversation away from incriminating topics, but Emma was relentless. Mr. Thompson, she said, her tone sharp, can you explain why payments from Horizon Ventures are tied to your personal bank account? Mr. Thompson shifted uncomfortably. That's none of your business. It's directly relevant to this case, Emma pressed. Horizon Ventures fabricated financial records to frame my client. Are you denying your connection to this company? Thompson glared at her. I don't have to answer that. Emma leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. You do if you want this court to believe your countersuit has merit. Thompson's attorney quickly interrupted. Objection. These questions are irrelevant to the countersuit. Emma turned to him, unflinching. They're entirely relevant, given the allegations against my client. If you want to talk about defamation, let's discuss the damage caused by Mr. Thompson's false accusations. The tension in the room was palpable. Thompson's attorney shifted tactics, redirecting the conversation back to the countersuit, but the cracks in their case were already showing. As the days passed, Emma's team uncovered even more damning evidence against Mr. Thompson. Jake's investigation revealed that Horizon Ventures wasn't the only shell company he controlled. Several others were linked to fraudulent schemes targeting low-income tenants. Armed with this information, Emma prepared to present her findings to the court. But as the hearing approached, the pressure began to take its toll. Reporters hounded Emma and Sarah, twisting the story into sensational headlines. Social media buzzed with debates over the case, and Emma found herself the target of both admiration and criticism. One evening, as she worked late in her grandmother's living room, Evelyn sat down beside her. You're carrying a lot on your shoulders, Emma, Evelyn said softly. You don't have to do this alone. Emma sighed, her exhaustion showing. I just want to do what's right, Grandma, but sometimes it feels like the whole world is against us. Evelyn smiled gently. The truth has a way of shining through no matter how dark things seem. Just keep going, one step at a time. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was electric. Emma presented her findings with precision, tying Mr. Thompson's web of shell companies to a pattern of fraud and abuse. She outlined how he had used these schemes to intimidate tenants and silence critics. Judge Harrison listened intently, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When Emma finished, the courtroom was silent. Mr. Bennett, the judge said, turning to the landlord's attorney, do you have any response to these allegations? Bennett stammered, clearly caught off guard. Your Honor, we believe these claims are unrelated to the countersuit. The judge cut him off. Unrelated? They speak directly to your client's credibility and pattern of behavior. This court will not proceed with the countersuit until these allegations are fully investigated. Emma felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. As the judge prepared to adjourn, a commotion erupted in the back of the courtroom. Two men in suits entered, flashing badges. Your Honor, one of them said, we're federal investigators. We've been conducting an investigation into Mr. Thompson, and we have a warrant for his arrest. Gasps filled the courtroom as the officers approached the landlord, who turned pale. This is a mistake, he shouted as they handcuffed him. You can't do this. Emma watched, her heart pounding. This was a victory, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over yet. The courtroom was in chaos as the federal agents led Mr. Thompson away in handcuffs. His protests echoed through the room, but the crowd's murmurs quickly drowned him out. Emma sat frozen in her seat, her mind reeling. She hadn't anticipated the landlord's arrest, But she knew this could dramatically shift the case. Judge Harrison banged his gavel, demanding order. This court will reconvene tomorrow to determine how to proceed, he announced before adjourning the session. Sarah turned to Emma, her voice trembling. Does this mean it's over? Is he going to jail? Emma shook her head. It's a big development, but it doesn't automatically end the case. We need to see how this plays out. Later that evening, Emma sat with Jake and Evelyn in the kitchen, poring over the day's events. Jake had been following the news online, where articles about Thompson's arrest were spreading like wildfire. Looks like the feds have been investigating him for years, Jake said, scrolling through his laptop. Tax fraud, wire fraud, tenant exploitation, you name it. This guy's been running schemes across the state. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. It's no wonder he was so desperate to silence Sarah. Exposing this case probably tipped the scales for the investigators. Emma nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. We need to prepare for tomorrow. Thompson may be out of the picture for now, but his attorney will likely try to push the countersuit forward. Jake frowned. Even without Thompson, they're still trying to fight? Possibly, Emma said. But the judge knows the truth is on our side. We just have to make sure we stay ahead of them. The next morning, the courtroom was quieter than usual. The absence of Mr. Thompson was palpable, but Mr. Bennett, his attorney, was present, looking more haggard than ever. Emma and Sarah took their seats, bracing for whatever came next. Judge Harrison entered and addressed the room. Before we proceed, I want to address the recent developments. The arrest of Mr. Thompson raises serious questions about the integrity of this case and the countersuit. However, this court still has a duty to evaluate all evidence before reaching a decision. Mr. Bennett stood, his voice wavering. Your Honor, while my client is unavailable, I believe the countersuit should proceed based on the merits of our claims. Emma stood in a response. Your Honor, the countersuit has no merit. The fabricated evidence, Mr. Thompson's arrest, and his established history of misconduct undermine any credibility the defense might have. The judge nodded slowly. Ms. Carter makes a strong argument. However, I will allow the defense to present their case before issuing a ruling. Mr. Bennett, you may proceed. Mr. Bennett called his first witness, a tenant from another property owned by Mr. Thompson. The man claimed that Thompson had always been kind and fair, insisting that the accusations against him were misunderstandings. Emma listened carefully, taking notes. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she approached the stand with confidence. Mr. Davis, she began, you've testified that Mr. Thompson was a fair landlord. Can you confirm if you've ever had any disputes with him? The man hesitated. No, not personally. Have you ever been threatened with eviction or faced unexpected rent increases? Well, no, he admitted. Are you aware that Mr. Thompson owns multiple properties under different business names? Emma pressed. The witness shifted uncomfortably. I've heard rumors. Emma smiled faintly. Rumors can be telling, can't they? No further questions, Your Honor. As the day wore on, the defense's case began to crumble. Their witnesses offered little more than vague praise for Thompson, and none could refute the mounting evidence against him. By the afternoon, it was clear that Mr. Bennett was running out of strategies. When it was Emma's turn to make her final argument, she stood with the quiet confidence that had become her trademark. Your Honor, she began, this case is about more than just my client. It's about standing up to those who abuse their power to exploit others. Mr. Thompson's arrest and the evidence we've presented leave no doubt about his actions. This countersuit is a desperate attempt to deflect blame, and it has no basis in truth. She paused, letting her words sink in. Sarah Johnson is a hardworking mother who has done nothing wrong. She deserves justice, and today this court has the opportunity to deliver it. Emma returned to her seat, her heart pounding as she sat beside Sarah. The judge announced that he would issue a ruling in 3 days, and the courtroom slowly emptied. As Emma and Sarah walked to the parking lot, a bailiff approached Emma with a sealed envelope. This was just delivered for you, he said. Emma opened it carefully, her heart pounding as she read the contents. It was a subpoena. Thompson's legal team had filed a motion to introduce new evidence, and the hearing was set for the next day. Her relief was short-lived. The fight was far from over. Emma's heart sank as she read the subpoena. New evidence, she muttered, her mind already racing with questions. What could Thompson's team possibly have left to present? And how could they have managed it with Thompson behind bars? Sarah, who had been basking in the judge's dismissal of the countersuit, noticed Emma's expression shift. What is it? She asked nervously. Emma handed her the document. They're filing a motion to introduce new evidence. We have a hearing tomorrow. Sarah's face paled. New evidence? What else can they throw at us? Emma put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Whatever it is, we'll be ready. This is just another desperate attempt to stall. That evening, Emma returned home and immediately called Jake. She explained the situation, and he was just as baffled as she was. New evidence? That's a bold move, considering the mess they're in, Jake said, typing furiously on his laptop. They've got to be banking on something big, or they're bluffing. Either way, we can't take chances, Emma replied. I need you to dig deeper into Thompson's legal team. See if they've been working with anyone new, especially since his arrest. I'm on it, Jake said. I'll let you know what I find. The next morning, Emma walked into the courtroom with her head held high, even as uncertainty gnawed at her. Sarah sat beside her, clutching her hands tightly in her lap. The room buzzed with anticipation, reporters and spectators eager to see what this latest twist would bring. Judge Harrison entered, his face unreadable. This court is now in session. Mr. Bennett, you've requested to introduce new evidence. Please explain its relevance. Mr. Bennett stood, holding a manila folder. His confidence seemed restored, and that worried Emma. Your Honor, this evidence directly challenges the plaintiff's claims of financial hardship and speaks to her credibility. He handed the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Harrison opened it, his expression neutral as he examined the contents. Miss Carter, the judge said, have you had the opportunity to review this evidence? No, Your Honor, Emma replied. This is the first time we're seeing it. Very well, the judge said. You'll have the chance to respond after Mr. Bennett presents his case. Emma braced herself as Mr. Bennett addressed the court. Your Honor, these are signed affidavits from multiple witnesses who claim to have seen Miss Johnson engaging in unreported business activities, including operating a cash-only daycare service from her apartment. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Sarah's face went white, and she turned to Emma, shaking her head. That's not true, she whispered. I don't know what they're talking about. Emma nodded, her mind already working to counter the claim. Don't worry, she whispered back. We'll handle this. Mr. Bennett continued, presenting the affidavits and photos that purported to show parents dropping off children at Sarah's apartment. The defense argued that this income undermined her claims of financial hardship and raised questions about her credibility. When it was Emma's turn to cross-examine, she approached the bench with her usual calm. Your Honor, may I examine these affidavits? The judge nodded, and the bailiff handed her copies of the documents. Emma scanned them quickly, noting discrepancies in the signatures and the vague language used by the witnesses. Mr. Bennett, as she began, can you confirm the identities of these witnesses and whether they've been deposed? Mr. Bennett hesitated. They have not been deposed yet, but their affidavits are signed and notarized. Emma smiled faintly. Notarized does not equal credible. Without depositions, we have no way of verifying the authenticity of these claims. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, I request that these witnesses be made available for depositions before this evidence is admitted. The judge nodded. That's a reasonable request. Mr. Bennett, arrange for your witnesses to be deposed by the end of the week. Until then, this evidence will not be considered. After the hearing, Emma and Sarah left the courthouse, the weight of the new allegations hanging over them. As they walked to the car, Sarah finally broke down. Emma, what if they believe this? She said, tears streaming down her face. I don't even know these people. How can I prove they're lying? Emma hugged her tightly. We'll prove it, Sarah. I promise. This is just another one of their games, and we're going to expose it. That evening, Jake called with an update. Emma, I found something interesting. One of the witnesses who signed those affidavits, she's connected to a company that has ties to Thompson's properties. Emma's eyes narrowed. You mean she's on his payroll? Not directly, Jake clarified. But she works for a property management firm that oversees some of his buildings. It's enough to raise questions about her impartiality. Emma nodded, a plan forming in her mind. That's exactly what we need. Can you gather more details? Already on it, Jake said. And get this, 2 of the other witnesses have connections to Horizon Ventures. I'm sending you everything now. Emma smiled for the first time all day. Jake, you're a lifesaver. The next morning, Emma prepared her deposition strategy. When the witnesses were called in, she systematically dismantled their credibility. She presented Jake's findings, showing their ties to Thompson and questioning their motivations for coming forward. One witness, visibly nervous, admitted under pressure that she had been paid to sign the affidavit. Another claimed to have no knowledge of the allegations, saying she had been told she was signing a petition about tenant rights. By the end of the depositions, it was clear that the new evidence was yet another fabrication. Emma presented her findings to Judge Harrison, who was visibly unimpressed with the defense's tactics. "Mr. Bennett," the judge said sternly, "this court has had enough of these baseless distractions. The evidence you've presented is inadmissible, and I'm considering sanctions against your client for attempting to mislead this court." Emma and Sarah exchanged relieved glances, but the victory was bittersweet. The lengths Thompson's team was willing to go made it clear that they weren't done fighting yet. As the hearing adjourned, Emma stepped outside into the crisp air, her resolve stronger than ever. But as she approached her car, a man in a dark suit stepped out of the shadows. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone icy, "a word of advice, back off. You don't know who you're dealing with." Emma stared at him, her pulse quickening, but her voice didn't waver. "If that's a threat, you'll need to do better, because I'm not going anywhere." The man in the dark suit gave Emma a chilling smile, his eyes narrowing. "Suit yourself," he said, his tone dripping with mockery, "but don't say I didn't warn you." Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowded parking lot. Sarah, who had just exited the courthouse, hurried over to Emma. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Emma replied, her eyes scanning the area. "But it's clear Thompson's team isn't just playing dirty. They're escalating." Sarah's face was pale. "Emma, this is getting dangerous. Maybe we should—" "No," Emma interrupted firmly. "That's exactly what they want. If we back down now, they win, and they'll keep doing this to other people." Sarah nodded reluctantly, but the fear in her eyes remained. That evening, Emma sat at her desk, replaying the encounter in her mind. The man's tone, his confident stride, and the vague but pointed threat, it all felt calculated. She called Jake, hoping he could shed some light on the situation. "Hey, Emma," Jake answered. "What's up?" She recounted the parking lot incident, describing the man in detail. "I don't know who he is, but he's clearly connected to Thompson or his team. Can you look into anyone new they might have hired?" Jake sighed. "It's possible they brought in private investigators or consultants. I'll dig around and see what I can find." "Thanks, Jake," Emma said. "And let me know if anything looks off. I've got a feeling this isn't over." The next morning, Emma arrived at the courthouse early, determined to maintain control of the case. To her surprise, Judge Harrison called her into chambers before the session began. "Miss Carter," he said, his expression unusually grave, "I've received a letter from Mr. Thompson's attorney requesting to delay the proceedings indefinitely, citing his client's legal troubles and inability to participate." Emma's brow furrowed. "Your Honor, this is another stalling tactic. The defense has repeatedly tried to derail this case. Granting them an indefinite delay would set a dangerous precedent." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "I agree that the request is suspect, but the court must balance fairness with efficiency. Do you have a proposal for how we should proceed?" Emma took a deep breath. "Your Honor, I request that the case move forward without further delays. If Mr. Thompson is unavailable, his legal team can represent him based on the evidence already submitted." Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "Very well. I'll deny the defense's request for an indefinite delay and set a final hearing date. Be prepared to present closing arguments next week." The announcement sent shockwaves through the courtroom when the session resumed. Mr. Bennett, clearly unprepared for this development, scrambled to object, but the judge held firm. "This case has dragged on long enough," Judge Harrison declared. "Both sides will present closing arguments next week, and this court will issue a ruling." After court adjourned, Sarah turned to Emma, her voice filled with a mix of relief and anxiety. "So this is it? It's almost over?" Emma nodded. "Almost. But we need to make sure our closing argument is airtight. This is our chance to seal the deal." That evening, Jake called with an update. "Emma, you're not going to believe this," he said, his voice laced with urgency. "I found out who that guy in the parking lot was. His name is Ethan Brooks, and he's a private investigator with a reputation for doing questionable work." "Questionable how?" Emma asked, her stomach tightening. "Harassment, intimidation, planting evidence, you name it," Jake replied. "He's been linked to several high-profile cases where the opposition suddenly dropped out after his involvement." Emma exhaled sharply. "So they're trying to scare us into quitting." "Exactly," Jake said. "But here's the kicker. Brooks is tied to another one of Thompson's shell companies. They're paying him directly." Emma's eyes narrowed. "That's exactly the kind of pattern we need to show the judge. Can you send me everything you have on Brooks?" "Already on its way," Jake replied. "Just be careful, Emma. This guy doesn't play by the rules." The next day, Emma incorporated Jake's findings into her case file. She knew presenting this information in court could be risky. Brooks's presence wasn't directly tied to the case, but it painted a clear picture of Thompson's tactics and lack of credibility. As she worked, Sarah called. Her voice panicked. "Emma, something's wrong. A man came to my apartment today asking questions about you." "What did he ask?" Emma asked, her pulse quickening. "Things like how we met, why I trusted you, and if I thought you were capable of handling the case," Sarah said. "He said he was a reporter, but something about him didn't feel right." Emma clenched her jaw. "That's Brooks. They're trying to dig up dirt on me now. Don't answer any more of his questions and let me know if he comes back, okay?" Sarah's voice shook. "Okay, but Emma, this is getting scarier every day. What if they hurt someone?" "They won't," Emma said firmly. "We're not going to let them intimidate us." The following week, the courtroom was packed as Emma and Mr. Bennett prepared to deliver their closing arguments. The tension in the air was palpable, with reporters and spectators eager to see how the case would conclude. Mr. Bennett went first, painting Thompson as a misunderstood landlord who had been unfairly targeted. His argument was filled with vague statements and emotional appeals, but it lacked substance. When it was Emma's turn, she stood confidently, her voice steady and clear. "Your Honor," she began, "this case has always been about one thing, justice. The evidence presented over the course of this trial has exposed a pattern of deceit, manipulation, and exploitation by Mr. Thompson and his team. From fabricated financial records to witness intimidation, their tactics speak volumes about their credibility, or lack thereof." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Sarah Johnson is a hardworking mother who has done nothing but fight for her right to live in peace. She deserves justice, and today this court has the opportunity to deliver it." Emma returned to her seat, her heart pounding as she sat beside Sarah. The judge announced that he would issue a ruling in 3 days, and the courtroom slowly emptied. As Emma and Sarah walked to the parking lot, a dark figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Ethan Brooks. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" he said, his tone laced with menace. "You're playing a dangerous game, kid." Emma stopped, standing tall despite the fear that rippled through her. "The only dangerous game here is the one you're playing, and you've already lost." Brooks smirked. "We'll see about that." Before Emma could respond, headlights swept across the parking lot, and a black SUV pulled up. Brooks turned and disappeared into the vehicle, leaving Emma and Sarah standing in the cold, silent night. 3 days later, the courtroom was packed again as Judge Harrison prepared to deliver his ruling. Emma sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly together. Sarah sat beside her, holding her breath. The judge cleared his throat. "After reviewing all evidence and testimony presented in this case," he began, "this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Sarah Johnson." The room erupted into applause and cheers, but the judge raised his hand for silence. "Furthermore," he continued, "this court will refer Mr. Thompson and his legal team for investigation into possible perjury, evidence tampering, and other misconduct." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she hugged Emma. "We did it," she whispered. "You did it." Emma smiled, her relief and pride mingling. But as she looked across the room and saw Mr. Bennett hurriedly packing his briefcase, she knew one thing for certain. This victory was just the beginning of her fight for justice. The courtroom victory was monumental, but Emma knew the fight wasn't truly over. As Sarah hugged her, the relief was palpable, but a lingering sense of unease tugged at the edges of Emma's thoughts. Thompson's arrest and the judge's ruling were victories, but they were only part of the battle. The broader system that allowed landlords like Thompson to exploit tenants still loomed large. That evening, as Emma returned home, her grandmother Evelyn was waiting with open arms. "You were incredible, Emma," Evelyn said, pulling her into a hug. "I'm so proud of you." Emma smiled, the warmth of her grandmother's embrace momentarily easing the weight on her shoulders. "Thanks, Grandma, but I think this is just the start. There are so many others like Sarah who don't have the resources to fight back." Evelyn nodded, her face thoughtful. "You've been given a gift, Emma. Maybe it's time to think about how you can use it to help more people." The next morning, Emma received a call from a local journalist. "Emma Carter," the voice on the other end said, "I'm Ryan Mitchell with the Tribune. I'd love to do a feature on you, highlight your work on the Thompson case and what it means for tenant rights." Emma hesitated. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight and didn't particularly enjoy the attention. But she realized that sharing the story could inspire others to stand up for themselves. "Okay," she said cautiously, but only if the focus stays on the case and the impact on tenants like Sarah. Absolutely, Ryan agreed. Let's schedule an interview later this week. The article went live, and it was more than Emma expected. The headline read, "Teen Titan Takes Down Corrupt Landlord, Sparks Hope for Tenants Everywhere." It detailed the trial, the tactics Thompson had used, and Emma's unrelenting fight for justice. The response was overwhelming. Emma received dozens of emails and messages from people across the country, many sharing their own stories of housing injustice. One email in particular stood out. "Dear Miss Carter," it began, "my name is Maria Lopez. I've been fighting a similar battle with my landlord for over a year. Your story gave me the courage to keep going. I was wondering if you'd be willing to advise me on my case. I can't afford a lawyer, but I could really use your help." Emma stared at the email, her mind racing. She wanted to help, but she was just one person. How could she take on more cases while still keeping up with her studies and personal life? "Grandma," she said later that evening, "people are asking for my help. I want to do more, but I don't know how." Evelyn sat beside her, her expression wise and calm. "You don't have to do it alone, Emma. There are people out there who share your passion. Maybe it's time to build something bigger." Emma spent the next few weeks brainstorming ways to expand her impact. She reached out to local lawyers, community activists, and nonprofit organizations focused on housing rights. Slowly but surely, a plan began to take shape. A grassroots initiative that would provide free legal aid to tenants facing eviction and exploitation. She called it the Justice Alliance. Jake jumped on board immediately, offering to handle the tech side of things. "We'll set up a website, social media, everything," he said excitedly. "This could really blow up." Sarah volunteered as well, eager to give back after everything she'd been through. "You saved me, Emma," she said. "The least I can do is help you save others." Meanwhile, the fallout from the Thompsons' arrest continued. News reports revealed that he was facing additional charges, including tax evasion and racketeering. Several of his properties were seized by the authorities, and tenants who had been wrongfully evicted began to speak out. But not everyone was happy about Emma's growing influence. One evening, as she worked late at the new Justice Alliance office, a small donated space in a community center, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Miss Carter," the voice on the other end said, low and menacing. "You think you've won, but you don't understand how deep this goes. Walk away while you still can." Emma's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" The caller chuckled darkly. "Let's just say I'm someone who knows how to make problems disappear. Consider this your last warning." The line went dead. Emma stared at her phone, her heart pounding. She immediately called Jake and told him about the threat. "That's insane," Jake said. "We need to report this to the police." Emma hesitated. "And say what? That some anonymous caller told me to stop helping people? Without proof, they won't do anything." "Still," Jake insisted, "you shouldn't take this lightly. You're getting under someone's skin and they're scared of what you're building." Emma took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "Then I must be doing something right." As the Justice Alliance gained traction, more stories came to light. Families who had been forced out of their homes, landlords who manipulated leases, and tenants who felt powerless. The movement began to grow, with volunteers stepping up to support the cause. But the threats didn't stop. Emma started noticing strange cars parked near her house, and once she found a threatening note taped to her door. "Quit while you can." One evening, as she was leaving the office, she spotted Ethan Brooks waiting outside. He leaned casually against a lamppost, his smirk as infuriating as ever. "You've made quite a name for yourself," he said as she approached. "But you're poking at things that don't like to be poked." Emma squared her shoulders, refusing to show fear. "I'm not afraid of you," Brooks chuckled. "Maybe you should be. People like me, we don't lose." "Neither do I," Emma shot back, brushing past him. The threats only fueled her determination. By the end of the year, the Justice Alliance had helped dozens of families avoid eviction and exposed several unethical landlords. Emma's story continued to spread, inspiring others to fight back against injustice. But Emma knew the fight wasn't over. The deeper she dug, the more corruption she uncovered. And as the movement grew, so did the enemies she made. Still, she wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The Justice Alliance's growth was unprecedented. In less than a year, Emma and her team had transformed a small initiative into a powerful force, uncovering systemic corruption in housing laws and holding landlords accountable. Yet with every victory, the threats against Emma escalated. Anonymous letters, late-night phone calls, and the ever-present shadow of Ethan Brooks reminded her that she was fighting a battle that stretched far beyond her initial case. One evening, after wrapping up a seminar at a local community center, Emma received an urgent call from Jake. "Emma, we've got a problem," Jake said, his voice tense. "I've been tracking some unusual activity tied to Thompson's old network. There's a massive real estate deal happening tomorrow. It involves one of his shell companies, Horizon Ventures, and a group of investors with a shady track record." Emma frowned. "What's the deal?" "They're planning to buy up a block of low-income housing, evict everyone, and flip it into luxury condos," Jake explained. "It's a textbook gentrification scheme, and they're using Thompson's playbook. If this goes through, dozens of families will be displaced." Emma's stomach twisted. "Do we have enough evidence to stop it?" "Not yet," Jake admitted, "but I found out where the signing is happening. If we can disrupt the meeting and expose their plans, we might be able to stop it." The next morning, Emma, Jake, and Sarah arrived at the downtown office building where the meeting was scheduled to take place. Armed with documents Jake had uncovered, they were ready to confront the investors and reveal the truth. As they entered the building, Emma spotted Ethan Brooks leaning against a wall near the elevator. He smirked when he saw her. "You're persistent. I'll give you that," he said, "but you're way out of your league this time." Emma stepped closer, her voice cold. "Maybe, or maybe you and your friends are finally about to lose." Brooks chuckled. "Good luck, you'll need it." Emma ignored him and headed to the conference room where the deal was set to be signed. Through the glass walls, she could see a group of men in suits gathered around a table, documents spread out before them. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room fell silent as the investors turned to look at her. "Can we help you?" one of them asked, his tone laced with irritation. Emma held up a folder. "I'm here to stop you from destroying people's lives." The men exchanged amused glances, but Emma pressed on. She placed copies of Jake's findings on the table and began explaining how the deal relied on fraudulent practices. As she spoke, their smirks faded. "This deal isn't just unethical, it's illegal," Emma said. "And if you move forward with it, we'll make sure the world knows exactly what you're doing." The tension in the room was thick. One of the investors, clearly rattled, muttered, "We need to discuss this privately." Another, less shaken, leaned forward. "You have no authority here, kid. Get out before we call security." Emma stood her ground. "You can call security if you want, but the evidence is already on its way to the media and the Attorney General's office. This meeting is over." For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the older investors sighed and stood up. "She's right. We can't take this risk. We're pulling out." The others followed suit, some grumbling, others glaring at Emma as they filed out of the room. Ethan Brooks appeared in the doorway, watching with a mixture of annoyance and admiration. "You really don't quit," he said. Emma turned to him, her voice steady. "Not when people's lives are at stake." Brooks's smirk faltered for the first time. He gave her a small nod, almost respectful, before walking away. The story of Emma's showdown at the investor meeting spread quickly, solidifying her reputation as a fearless advocate for justice. The Justice Alliance received an outpouring of support, with donations and volunteers flooding in. The block of housing Emma had saved became a symbol of hope, and tenants began organizing their own efforts to protect their rights. But Emma knew the fight was far from over. She had learned that the system was deeply flawed, and for every landlord like Thompson or investor scheme she exposed, there were more waiting in the shadows. One evening, as she sat with Evelyn and Sarah, Emma reflected on the journey so far. "It feels like we're just scratching the surface," she said. "There's so much more to do." Evelyn smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "You've already made a difference, Emma, and you're inspiring others to stand up too. That's how real change begins." Sarah nodded. "You gave me my life back. You're doing more than just fighting cases. You're giving people hope." Emma smiled, a sense of purpose washing over her. "Then I guess we keep going." Years later, Emma Carter would go on to become a renowned attorney and activist, leading a nationwide movement for tenant rights and housing reform. The Justice Alliance expanded into a powerful organization, helping thousands of families and rewriting laws to protect the vulnerable. And though the threats never fully disappeared, Emma never wavered. She had learned that the fight for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. Because for every person like Sarah Johnson who found their voice, the world became a little brighter. Emma's story became a beacon, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person could make a difference, and that the fight for justice was always worth fighting.